Did you hear the story about what did Obi-Wan tell Luke when the young apprentice was having a difficult time using chopsticks? Use the forks, Luke. Or no, another one. Here we go. What did the dentist say to Luke Skywalker? May the floss be with you. Or trying to come up with dad jokes about Star Wars is difficult. Sometimes they feel a bit too forced. Apologies. It's just another one of the realms of dad jokes that I've inherited and got into. But clearly the point in here is force. And as we move in, may the force be with you as we enter the force field analysis theory. So welcome. So after that little bit of a dad joke, you can see the purpose of this lesson here is looking at the key principles of the force field analysis theory. So no more Star Wars jokes, but we're looking at the force field analysis theory from Lewin. And we're going to be picking out the key parts of his theory, which is weighting, ranking, implementing a response, and evaluating the response. So let's get straight into it. As we've been following on from the lessons, we've seen business change is an ongoing theme that we're looking at here. And it's an ever-present consideration for any modern business. Change is everywhere, and we need to respond appropriately to change. Importantly, if we don't and we fail to respond to change, then a whole raft of things are going to have to deal with. We might get employees resenting us because they don't feel part of it, or they might lose their jobs as a part of it. We might get a high staff turnover where staff are dissatisfied by the whole approach. We might get low productivity because they're demotivated. We might get the share price decline because our profits decline because our customers aren't liking our products anymore. They don't meet their needs, customer dissatisfaction. The shareholders ultimately could vote off the CEO at a public listed company AGM meeting. And ultimately business failure. So we need to leap with faith to the new condition. We need to change and we need to adapt and move through the business. Now, this theory we're going to look at here is how we manage that change, how we consider the driving and restraining forces that are at play during change, and how we navigate that process through to hopefully achieve successful change. So, who is this guy? Well, Kurt Lewin was a social psychologist who in 1951 created this force field analysis theory to deal with things that he saw in society as a psychologist. However, it's been used in business and to guide businesses towards achieving their goals consistently since then. So it's a theoretical model that understands that businesses have driving and restraining forces at play. And they usually exist in a state of equilibrium where those forces acting in a business will be driving change while others will restrain it. For change to happen, therefore, to break that equilibrium, the driving forces must be strengthened or the restraining forces weakened so that the driving forces can effectively overpower the restraining forces and you move to that new situation where a new equilibrium is reached. So you can see it's a theoretical model. We're going to now apply it to business and you can see that model at play. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a working model to hopefully make that make more sense to you. So for change to happen, as we said, these driving forces must be strengthened or the restraining forces weakened. So the driving forces overpower and we reach this new equilibrium. Okay, that's the theory behind it. So once a goal or vision for change has been defined, and then we work out what the forces for and against it, then we can use a series of steps to determine how we proceed with the change. So the idea being is, you think of any business, okay, we want to move forward, but those are the driving forces that are pushing it forward. Equally at the same time, there's things saying no, holding up the business from achieving that change. They're resisting. Okay, they're the restraining forces. We end up this point here where those two forces reach an equilibrium. We need to find a way to try and move forward and achieve that change. So let's have a very visual example of how this all comes together in terms of our business. So let's take a business now. We're going to make it a electric scooter business. Okay, so we're running a domestic electric scooter business. It's been running for a few years. It's very successful. However, we've got a new goal. What is our goal? Well, we're thinking of making an overseas manufacturing plant. We're already producing the electric scooters in Australia very successfully, but we want to try and increase our sales and profit. And we think that by one, making them and selling them overseas and expanding the market reach is going to add to our sales and will add to our profit, to what is already a very successful business. So that's our goal. First step, we have a goal. We then visually line up our driving and restraining forces. The driving forces, these are the things that are pushing for the change, that want the change to occur. And our restraining forces are the things that are holding back against that, resisting, don't want that change to occur. So we're thinking about what are these forces for change. Now the driving, very visual, okay? We've got a car here driving in, okay? And we want to be thinking, what are they? Okay, firstly, we've got a competitor that's worked out that the electric scooter market is a great one and has come into the market. So we're thinking, okay, we better do something about this and respond, or we're going to lose our competitive advantage. So our idea of overseas manufacturing is to respond to that driving force. It's driving us, forcing us to respond. Equally, we've got shareholders. We're a very successful business. We've got shareholders and they've seen us make great profits, but they want more profits for the future. Okay, they want to get their return on investment up, and so they really want us to do this. So this is a big force for forcing us to change. We've also got a new chief executive officer, and obviously they want to cement their standing in the business and be very successful and say, yes, we did something here, and we put our footprint for what we've achieved. So we have our driving forces for change. We can see why it's trying to force us to achieve that. Equally though, we have our restraining forces. We have things that are holding us back from achieving this change. Employee fear. Whenever you go through change, people are naturally nervous. They're nervous about their job security. Will I still have a job? Will I lose my job? What type of job will I have in the future? If this overseas manufacturing was to take place, will I be relocated over there? Will I have to leave my family? All of those things could create fear. And so that's a very natural resistance factor. Another one, clearly, overseas manufacturing plant is going to be very expensive. And so the idea being, do we have enough money to achieve that? Are we going to be able to support this business? We might have legislation issues, both in Australia and overseas, about setting up this plant. What are the building requirements? What are the restrictions? Where can we build it? Where can't we build it? How will it operate? How many staff do we need to have? How do we need to set up the occupational health and safety in another country? So there's legislation to take account of. And that, again, may make it harder for us to achieve our objectives. And we may even have some resistance from a few managers who think that this isn't a very clever idea and aren't supportive of it. So we now have our forces for change and forces against change, and we can see them lined up. If you think about it, they're creating like a rugby scrum effect, whereby the driving forces are locked horns with the restraining forces, and we've now reached this equilibrium where we're just sitting put. Now, clearly, we want to get to this new position. We want to achieve these objectives. So we want the driving forces either to overpower the restraining forces, or we want to find a way to weaken the restraining forces so that we can push through. Exactly like in a rugby scrum. So if you've ever seen rugby at play, that's the sort of analogy we're going with here. We've got that tussle between the two forces. We want one to overcome the other. So the next role is to then weight the forces. Now, what we mean by weighting is we're putting a feeling of how heavy they are, how much of a pressure are they. So we're trying to put a weight of how important they are in this process. So here we have some weightings, okay? We have responding them to competitors. It's important, but it's not as important as some of the other factors of driving us. So yes, we're responding to them, and that's something we're considering. We're going to give that a score out of 3 out of 10 for weighting. However, the expectations from the shareholders are massive. Okay, so we're giving that the full 10 out of 10. They're the ones that are trying to push this through and want us to embrace this building overseas manufacturing plant. And the new CEO is also a major force here. So we have a score system here where we have now 20 lined up on the driving forces. Equally, on the other side, we have these restraining forces. And again, the employee fear is a massive one. It's 10 out of 10. Okay, so we've got to consider that one. They're really nervous about it. Then the lack of finance and the legislation are things we need to consider. But the resistance from manager, yes, it's there, but it's a much more a lower level score. But once again, when we add it up, we now have 20. And so we can see why we've at the moment got an equilibrium. These forces, the weightings are exactly the same, and therefore we've reached this equilibrium and the rugby scrum is locked in position. What we need to then think about is about which ones are the more important ones, and which ones do we need to prioritize to be able to overcome or weaken some of these forces. So when we look at it and rank them in order, we now have the responding competitors. Again, we're aware of it, but it's less important than the shareholder expectations. So we're conscious of this one. These ones just naturally are beautifully lined up, but we now have a ranking effect. So you can see we're going to be targeting these ones first to try and either make these ones stronger or reduce the power of these ones. So we have our ranking. We're then going to go, okay, what is the strategy that's going to allow us to either boost this side or reduce this side here? So we come up with the idea of a relocation program and a job guarantee. The idea being is that if you're a worker and you're really, really nervous about this overseas manufacturing and that you're going to lose your job to the overseas manufacturing, or you're worried about moving to another country with your family, well, if we put in place a relocation program where we're going to pay employees money to relocate and get a new house, and we're going to support them with their health bills, and we're going to help them find schools for their children, that's going to make them feel really good. Equally, if we offer them a job guarantee program where we go, okay, this is going to be in your best interest and we promise you you're not going to lose your job. Well, by doing that, we might be able to reduce this fear factor from 10 down to 1. And that's going to have a massive effect here. We're going to change this whole scaling from 20 to 20 to 20 to, let's work this one out there, we've got 10, 11, okay? And now you can see that the driving forces do overpower the restraining forces. Those restraining forces holding us back have been weakened, and therefore the driving forces can now push through to this new desired position where we establish the manufacturing plant and achieve our objectives. So we implement the change, which deliberately targets this employee fear factor. We could equally have done something on this side here to boost some of the driving forces to make them more powerful or more apparent, or we could have targeted a different one of the restraining forces. But we can see, hopefully, by doing this strategy, we're going to target that one specifically because it's the biggest one. We could see it was really important. We're going to now make it much smaller and therefore allow us to achieve our change. And then ultimately, what we want to then do is see whether that was successful. Was the thing that we attempted to achieve of increasing sales and profit by 25% achieved by this process? And if not, then we might look at another strategy at play. Hopefully you can see in a very visual sense how this all comes together. We have a force field analysis theory where we're lining up the driving and restraining forces. We then lay them out and weight them, give a feeling of the strength and the power behind them. We rank them. We then create a strategy to either boost the driving forces or reduce the power of the restraining forces. We implement a strategy and then we evaluate the response to that. So let's take now the principles in turn and add a little bit more detail behind them. So we have in here weighting. What is weighting? Well, weighting is the process of giving each force a score. Okay, so we're giving it a weight, we're giving it a score according to the degree of influence, the power it has on the plan. So in our example there, we wanted to build the overseas manufacturing plant. The most heavily weighted force was the shareholder expectations. They were the big one. So we had 10 out of 10 there for the shareholder expectations. We equally weighted the restraining forces. And the highest one there was 10 out of 10 for employee fear. So by giving them a weight, we can work out how important they are and how much attention we've got to put on those forces, either driving or restraining forces. So then we come to ranking. And ranking involves using these scores and the weighting we gave them, okay, to order each force from most to least influential. So we can work out which ones are really important, which we need to target first, and which ones are least important. Now, it's important at this stage as well. When we put those numbers on there, we're working out what's happened. Are we got the driving forces overcoming the restraining, or is there an equilibrium? So we tally up these scores to determine the success we're already hoping to achieve from the change. So if that's to be implemented successfully, we know the score for the driving force has to eventually be higher than the score for the restraining change. So let's apply that to the example we had. So we had the car example, and we arranged the driving forces to visually show what the most and least powerful. And if you remember, we moved the managers down on the driving force because that was only a 3 out of 10. So we've changed the numbers. If you remember, the overall score for the driving was 20. The overall for the restraining was 20. And so what do we think that's going to achieve? Well, at that point there, we know we've now got an equilibrium. That the driving forces exactly match the restraining forces, so we can't budge. There's not going to be any movement between it. So now we can then target which ones were the higher ranking ones to try and either boost them on the driving side or reduce them on the restraining side. So the next step is then implementing a response. So we've worked out the driving forces and the restraining forces. We've worked out the weightings for them. We've worked out now the rankings of them, and we're going to target the top ones to therefore be able to boost or reduce the other side here. So we can now decide whether or not to move forward with implementing the change based on whether the forces against change outweigh the forces for it. We can also consider, as we're going to do now, a strategy to strengthen the driving force or weaken the restraining forces. So in our example, the change we decided to go with was a relocation program and a job guarantee program. We worked out that the employee fare was going to be 10 out of 10. And therefore, if we could do this approach to try and make them happy about that transition, it would reduce it to 1 out of 10. And therefore make our 20 match not 20, but now beat 11. And therefore, we'll be able to push through and achieve the change. So we're going to now, at this point here, implement our response. Then we come to evaluating the response. In evaluating, we must consider whether the goal objective that we set out in the beginning with has been achieved. And if not, what can be now done to either further strengthen the forces, driving forces, or weaken the restraining? So the idea being is if we didn't quite get there, what happened? Were the restraining forces bigger than we anticipated? Or were the driving forces weaker than we anticipated? Putting all that place to place is, remember, the idea behind the force field analysis is a situation maintained by an equilibrium by the forces of the drive, change, and resist. For change to occur, we've either got to strengthen those driving forces or we've got to weaken those restraining forces. So we can now achieve a new equilibrium at our new point that we're happy with. So putting that all into place, you can see those steps in place that we can follow through the force field analysis theory. So if we look here at a worked example, we're explaining the purpose of the key principle of weighting. So we're focusing on this one here. The key principle of weighting, what is its purpose in the force field analysis theory? So we've got 3 marks attributed to it. So we try and break it down. We're trying to work out where the marks might be. We're going to be here, as you can see here, an example of what's sometimes called global marking. How much detail is involved? If there's a strong amount of detail, we're going to give it 3 marks, good detail or basic detail. Now, sometimes this gets applied in exam or SAC type responses, so it's good to understand that. The marks was the first indication to you of how much detail to attribute to it. So we know we need to have a little bit more than something that's very much of a basic outline. So if we look at this sample answer here, hopefully you can see that. By assigning a score weight to each of the driving and restraining forces, the business can decide whether or not to move forward with a change, based on whether the forces against change outweigh the forces for it. The principle of weighting also requires a business to consider strategies to strengthen some of the driving forces or weaken some of the restraining forces so that successful change can occur. So you can see it's more than just a basic answer. There's some detail behind it. They've fully drawn out what it means to be weighting and also its purpose in the whole process of the force field analysis theory. So hopefully you can see there an example of a good 3 out of 3 response. Okay, so hopefully here you can see in this summary a nice visual concept map. You might want to print this one off where you can see all the points at play. Okay, so think about, we have a goal. Okay, we then have the driving forces and the restraining forces. We list them down below. We then put a weight behind them. How important are they? Have we reached change or is an equilibrium being held at? If it isn't being achieved, how do we either boost the driving forces or reduce the restraining forces to allow the change to occur and reach our new position? We then consider the strategies which we can implement to achieve that, and then we evaluate the final response to see whether we achieved our aim objectives. So hopefully here a nice visual concept map which puts all of that together. What we're moving on to our next lesson is driving forces in a bit more detail, so I look forward to seeing you then.